Next, we have drones and the right to free speech, something we refer to frequently as the First Amendment. And we have Jim Ewert from the California Newspaper Publishers Association and Stan Statham, President and CEO of the California Broadcasters Association. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today and addressing this rather important subject. Mr. Ewert, do you wish to go ahead and start?
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. I'm Jim Ewert with the California Newspaper Publishers Association, and thank you for inviting me to make some remarks today. CNPA and the newspaper industry generally, we're still trying to get our arms around the issue, quite frankly. Anecdotally, I think there's only one newspaper that has even experimented with the use of drones just to see how it would operate and what beneficial uses it could provide in a news gathering context, and that's the Fresno Bee. And I had a brief conversation with the editor of the Bee just to kind of talk about some of the rules that they set out for themselves in using the drone. And it was kind of interesting because the very first thing that he said, mindful of your bill, was we don't fly over private land. And there's a deep respect for that. And so what I'd like to do a little bit right now, since there's not a development of a lot of law in this area yet, is to just maybe briefly discuss generally the law as it relates to privacy and news gathering that journalists currently use, and hopefully that will create some questions or provoke some questions. But at the outset, I'd like to just point out that the law and the cases right now really tend to try to balance the tension that necessarily exists between the right to privacy and the public interest in using information that's gathered either in a public context or in a public way. And the general rule with respect to the First Amendment is that any person has the right to capture still or moving images of anything he or she can see from a lawfully occupied vantage point. So generally, if you're looking at a public space and whether someone is standing in a public space and attempting to capture an image or footage, whatever, generally if they're in a public place, that's okay. Now there are some limitations to that. Several court decisions have found that even though the image itself may be okay to capture and to observe, that a recording, an audio recording, in certain contexts may not be. In a situation where there is an accident on a public highway and there's a conversation between a caregiver and the victim, that may or may not be subject to privacy. That victim may have a reasonable expectation of privacy. Or similarly, in a context where there is an investigative story being done on telepsychics or telepathic phone calls. Someone who is recording a conversation between the telephone caller and the telepsychic may have an expectation of privacy in that conversation as well. So it's very narrow, as you can see, and it's very fact-specific. It's context-driven. And then, of course, you get to California Civil Code section 1708.8, both A and B, as the analysis noted. And there, you have both a physical invasion of trespass and a constructive trespass in each of those sections. And we are very mindful of that, and we have testified against every single bill that has put that into place or amended it. And still to this day, that has not withstood any constitutional scrutiny, while we still recognize it as the law of California. There may still be some First Amendment aspects to determine the parameters of its application. The areas that start to get really interesting, though, is when we start talking about private areas and the ability to access private areas in order to gather news. And the general rule there, of course, as set forth in 1708.8, is that you need permission in order to enter the area. The problem is trying to determine who has that authority to grant permission. And this is where the details, the devil's in the details. For instance, if you have a situation where you have a landlord, let's say, of a housing accommodation or a commercial business, and there are tenants that rent space from the landlord, who does the news gatherer go to obtain permission? Is it the tenant? The news gatherer may want to get information from the tenant specifically, but if the landlord attempts to intercede as the owner of the property, is there authority to deny access? In a context where you have a vendor, let's say, who has taken out a permit for a public area. An example would be in Folsom, there's a Prairie City racing series where the state park out there is closed down to general use, and it's used by mountain bike enthusiasts who race there every Wednesday or Thursday night. Now, if someone wanted to, a news gatherer wanted to use a drone to show that event or to identify the impact that event has on the state park, would that news gatherer get the information from the vendor who has control or the state? And one granted permission and the other didn't. These are all issues that I think need to be considered and determined as the committee goes forward. And of course, you know, when you're talking about situations where you have large public gatherings, either by virtue of a newsworthy event, occupant or occupy demonstration, let's say, or a significant law enforcement presence because of something that's happening. In that particular context, if there's a need, or not a need, but if for whatever reason the drone or UAV inadvertently flies over private land to cover a very public event, what, if any, penalties should occur in that context? Should a news gatherer be penalized for that? And then the other context, I think the previous panel did a pretty good job of identifying when information is obtained through the use of UAVs by government agencies in the performance of their duties. And the public use and the public utility of that information. And right now, under current law, the California Public Records Act does a pretty good job of identifying, you know, how that information should be used. There's a presumption of access that the public has to that information if it's prepared, used, owned, or maintained by a government agency. And there are exceptions to that general requirement that that information be disclosed. And there is a greater public utility in each of those exceptions, one of which is privacy, I might add. But it requires a balancing of those interests, identifying the interests and a balancing of those interests so that there is a global approach that's taken, and the public interest in the disclosure of that information is recognized, and the utility is protected for the use of that information. That also exists in the California Constitution. There's a constitutional right of access to that information. You mentioned Article 1, Section 1, where the right to privacy exists. Article 1, Section 3, 2 sections below it, 1 section below the right to free speech, delineates the public's right of access to information that's held by government agencies and used by government agencies. And again, Just like in the previous example that I gave, it's also very fact-specific and context-driven. And in a situation where information may be, it may be appropriate to disclose information in the aggregate in order for the public to have an understanding of an issue, such as, how many fatalities or near fatalities occurred in California's child protective system for a given year. In the aggregate, that may be good information. But if we're talking about a situation where in the middle of a drought, there is a large number of homeowners who are overwatering or using high amounts of water, more detailed information may be necessary for the public to understand that the agency itself is not playing favorites or appropriately and fairly enforcing its regulations. So in closing, I just want to say that as the committee goes forward, it's important for everyone to identify clear distinctions in whatever law so that there's not that inadvertent violation, there's not that chilling effect or chilling impact on news gathering going forward, and that the public's ability to continue to gather information and, more importantly, for the news media to use that information to inform the public is protected and is recognized as well.
Thank you very much. Very helpful information. Good afternoon, sir.
Madam Chair and members of the committee, I'm Stan Statham, President of the California Broadcasters Association, which it even surprises me, represents slightly more than 1,000 radio and television stations in California. New York used to be the big time. It's California now for the last couple of decades. I'll try to make this very short. I appreciate your generosity. I'm so delighted that you specifically and the committee is diving into this issue because it's here to stay. Now, we don't need drones, but we love them and we want to use them. This many decades, 4 decades ago, I was a disc jockey in Sacramento, California. Then I became a news director. And then I got all excited about television, moved to Chico, became an anchorman on a CBS television station. In the process of doing all that, I developed a slogan, a few words that were on the beginning and end of each newscast, which after the drum roll, you would hear, information is the cornerstone of democracy. Jim, you interrupted me. I'm joking. Information is the cornerstone of democracy. And I'll be damned if it isn't. And that's what we do. We gather information and disseminate it. And I hope I don't get in trouble for this. Let me tell you clearly, we do not want to take video of Kim Kardashian, whatever her name is, having a baby. However, if we discover through reliable sources that she's selling babies, we're going to get that story for you. We want you to know because you're at the seat of power and you have the ability to regulate it and create laws that regulate it. And so we are so glad that you invited us here and would like to be involved more with how it's regulated. And I'm delighted, the good news and bad news all over the place. I'm delighted that the FAA is acting. I'm delighted that Barack Obama is acting. But the FAA's action is going to take another 3 to 5 years before it gets out there. It's got to happen, and I hope sooner than later. And I beg that you would involve us and the California broadcasters when you do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Kim Kardashian's wedding occurred not far from my house, and they used helicopters instead of drones. And I think the wedding lasted longer than the marriage. But that being said, I'm not sure I would have been happy with drones hovering over our
Did you get pictures?
I wasn't interested, I have to admit. Little did I know, I guess they sold for a lot of money. But, you know, again, for the neighborhood and the whole general area, there was some real question about the behaviors that both were on the property and as people were trying to gather that information. Of course, with drones, we're seeing more and more of them out there. I anticipate in the future trying to collect information. We will definitely want your input, and I certainly appreciate the balancing that we need to pursue in this area. First Amendment, very important right that we certainly don't want to undermine. But we have to figure out, as you say, I like the comment. I keep asking myself, why do we need drones? We got some good reasons here for agriculture, for fighting fires, but do we really need them to see what's going on in our neighbor's yard? And maybe that's part of the question. Where are they really critically important? Where are they helpful? Where do they benefit society? And where do they not? And I'm not sure I have the answers, but those are probably good questions that we should continue asking as we go forward. So I don't have any further questions at this point. Take heed in your comments about identifying the various interests and balancing them. The public certainly has an interest in disclosure of things where the public should be involved and knowledgeable, and that's not a new issue. Drones haven't raised that for the first time, but certainly the use of drones as part of that will be something that we'll be looking at. And Senator Anderson?
Well, I have just two quick comments. I was at an event in San Diego, and a drone came and covered the event, and somebody had mentioned it was the San Diego Union Tribune. It sounds like they're not doing it, but I don't know, maybe they are doing it. But everyone seemed to understand it was the UT. It was fascinating because, you know, we were up on stage, there were a bunch of folks speaking, and they got a bird's eye view, and I wanted to go back and look at the paper and see if they had a photo of it, because it was a nice crowd that they covered, and I thought it was fascinating. And Stan, I just wanted to thank you for your time in the Assembly. As an Assembly member, you parlayed the TV and everything else to get on the wrong side of the camera. So thank you for your comments today.
Thanks very much, Joel. Thank you.
Now, it's interesting you didn't mention that you had been here. Is that because it's sort of a reduction in stature, or was it just?
Oh, I don't believe it's a reduction in stature. Matter of fact, when I came in, Mark Leno and I rushed to each other because we have to tell stories. I love this place. It drives me nuts.
You're not alone.
I can't keep you all straight. And you're Tobias, right? Well, can you straighten them all out?
He's trying. He's trying.
Good work.
Thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate your time. Our last panel, drones, property rights, and land management. Jason DeWall and Chief Mitch Tavera from the California Police Chiefs Association. And Jason DeWall is here on behalf of the California State Parks. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for coming. My understanding is you're going to talk to us a little bit about some of the challenges that you've had, at least in the parks, state parks, managing drones and the impacts that they have had or might have on land management and wildlife. So that should be very interesting. And if one of you would like to start.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you, Chairwoman Jackson and the rest of the committee for allowing us to come speak today. My name is Jason DeWall. I'm Chief of Law Enforcement and Emergency Services for California State Parks, and with me I have Superintendent Todd Thames and Environmental Program Manager Lori Archambault to field questions or help us along the way if we need it. So, you know, in state parks, we're a very mission-driven organization, and we're tasked with protecting our natural and cultural resources and the public within our park system, and also their recreational rights. And we recognize that the use of unmanned aircraft, or drones as we've been calling them today, is a recreational activity. So we do see that there does need to be a balance. The gentleman before us talked about balance, and we do see that there does need to be a balance. And with that, we have been working within our own department, within the Law Enforcement and Emergency Services Division and Park Operations, on some research on what does that look like for our park visitors, both those that wish to recreate with drones, because mostly we're working with hobbyists in the park system that are out there, and those that may oppose it, or maybe we do have some concerns for our cultural and natural resources. So I polled the field, and once we found out we were going to be able to come and speak today, and asked, you know, what are you guys seeing in the field? What do we have going on out there? And we had both positives and some concerns that came our way. So I'd like to speak to a couple
Please
of
do.
those if I could. On the public safety side, we do have some fears, especially parents with children. If they're at the beaches and drones are flying overhead, or people taking pictures of their children, what exactly is going on? It was mentioned earlier that when a drone's in the air, we're not real clear what they're doing. Some of them you can see the cameras, some of you can't. You don't know what kind of data they're taking, if they are at all. So we do have those concerns from members of the public. Also, along the public safety concerns, many of our parks, either within our parks or just adjacent to our parks, we have some restricted areas or highly sensitive areas. As you know, we have recreation facilities along our state water project. And so we have dams and the California Aqueduct and things of that nature that we do have some concerns that have been addressed in the field for the use of drones and gathering intelligence and that type of thing. Along the natural resource aspect, we've had some issues with recreational drone use and fires. It crashed and had small fires. Those fires, as you know, last year, the state of California, we had some significant fire issues the last few years due to the drought, but those fires can cause significant damage within our park system, obviously outside of our boundaries as well. And cultural resource impacts. As you know, a lot of our cultural resource areas are very sensitive, and the identity of those areas are kept strictly confidential. And the use of drones could make it easier for somebody to gather that information on where those cultural sensitive areas are, which could possibly lead to looting and things of that nature. Now, what I just talked about there, those were all, mostly some of the negative impacts, but there are some positive things and uses for drones that we've recognized in state parks. We recognize that we don't have the resources today, but they could be used as useful tools for us, ourselves as state parks, survey land, actually identify some of those areas that we talked about that were protected earlier. And we've had instances where they have been used under the permit process for scientific reasons. We talked about elephant seals earlier, and not earlier here, but me amongst our staff, and surveying the elephant seals with minimal impact. And we also know that it can cut down costs for different types of things for us in the department. Some of those things aren't even identified yet because it is so new. But one thing that was very prevalent when we polled the field is over the last year and a half or so, we've noticed a spike in use. And probably because the cost has come way down, and also they're much easier to operate than they were 3 or 4 years ago. And so we're seeing a spike in use. And in conclusion, as I said before, our department right now is currently researching ways to manage this use, and just so we can protect our cultural and natural resources, and also the public's right to recreate within our park system.
Thank you. Anyone else from Parks want to comment on this? I had an understanding that we were seeing some concern about wildlife, and that, in fact, the federal parks have banned the use of drones in the federal parks. Is that something that you believe would be appropriate here in California?
Yeah, absolutely, and I'm sorry I didn't mention that earlier. It's actually in my notes. So we do, as you know, we have federally protected species within our park system, of course, in our open lands, and we do have concerns with the use of drones disturbing protected species and just wildlife in general.
Have you had any instances of problems associated with that?
One instance that I'm aware of is in one of our park units, we had a drone nearly collide with an osprey that was returning to its nest with some nesting material, and the bird had to do some evasive maneuver to not get hit by the drone. So that's one instance that I've been told about, which I thought was pretty dramatic. And we've also seen instances of birds flushing as a result of the use. They're loud, and many species, particularly bird species, perceive aerial objects as being predators. So a drone flying over would be perceived that way. And as I'm told, a lot of them are pretty noisy. I have not witness that.
So if I were hiking and I had, gone into a park and was a few miles in, put my tent up and wanted to enjoy nature, should I be offended or shocked or kind of unhappy that suddenly a drone shows up? I mean, is that, in using a state park, should there be an expectation of at least somewhat leaving civilization and, commuting perhaps with a bear rather than a drone?
Yeah, you bring up a point that we have discussed within our own department, and the use of drones, or actually seeing drones, does change somebody's recreational experience for sure. Whether you're going to be upset or not is up to you or the next person down the road. But we do hear often that somebody wants to get out away from these types of things, and they do not expect to see that in a state park in general.
Yeah, I'd be interested in seeing a sign that said "Caution: Drones on Path." Okay. All right. Thank you.
You had mentioned earlier, too, the challenge that the National Park Service has had. And if you look at their federal regulations, they very much mirror the same situation we're in with regards to our regulations. Our regulations really only address aircraft as defined as carrying a human being while being propelled. And over the years, we've always dealt with that type of recreation of model aircraft, and helicopters and things of that sort, and been able to guide that usage, in some of our areas through a superintendent's order, much the same as the MPS has done in the past as well. But with these new aircraft, unmanned aircraft, and the technology, the duration that they can fly, the size of them, it just adds another challenge into with our abilities to make sure that we do continue to protect our valuable cultural and natural resources. These are, like Chief DeWall has said, these are things that were being looked at department-wide and trying to come up with solutions.